Facebook and YouTube. I'm going to get Instagram set up, and then we are going to get into our Q&A for anything about writing, editing, publishing, marketing, any questions you have about the writing process or marketing, again, anything. We're going to talk about it today. So if you have some questions, feel free to leave those in the comments, and I will be answering those as we go along, plus some other ones from things that people have asked me in the past. So we're going to chat about those. Let me get Instagram set up, and then we will get ready to go. Awesome. Hi, Instagram. Thank you so much for coming. Today is the Q&A about writing, editing, self-editing, publishing, marketing, even Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, whatever questions you have about the writing life, I want to know. So please leave those in the comments, and then we'll go over some ones that I have gotten in the past as well. So I am live here on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and we are going to get started. I would love to, again, chat about anything about the writer life. I mean, this could be even like, I don't know, like how to write a series, or how to pick a genre, or, you know, anything about self-editing, anything about your writer mindset, getting in the right mindset for the writing process. I mean, really like anything. So we're going to chat about some questions that I've gotten in the past. And then if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I would love to chat with you. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is self-editing. So one of the questions I've had about self-editing in the past is just kind of general struggles about having to do self-editing in the first place, which I can completely relate to. Self-editing is my least favorite part of the process. And it's because there's a lot of different drafts, and there's a lot of mindset issues that come into play. And that was actually another one of the questions, is how do you get out of your own way while you're self-editing? And also a similar one, let's see, second guessing everything that's in your book. That can be a struggle too. Knowing the difference between improving your story and second guessing something that should actually stay in there. So we're going to talk about a few of those things when it comes to self-editing. Okay, and also having the courage to read your manuscript multiple times, which can be tricky. So, okay, let's talk about why self-editing first is important. We're going to talk about the self-editing process. So self-editing is defined as any editing that you do on your own story that you've written. So, basically, anytime you've written something and you start tweaking it, it's self-editing. Now, some people will say that, and this was another question I got, should you edit while you're drafting? Now, my opinion is a lot of people say, no, don't edit while you're drafting, don't do it at all. But I actually do that myself. While I am writing, I will edit. Now, I don't do it at the same exact time, but I do go back and edit something, say, that I've written the day before. So it's just, yeah, it's helpful to find your own process. And that's really the most important thing, is to find the process that works for you, that's going to give you the most benefit, that feels most natural to you. Because if it's a struggle, you're probably not going to do it either, not at all, or not as quickly. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave those in the comments. I would love to chat with you about that. Right now, we're talking about some questions I've had in the past about self-editing, but if you have any questions about any part of the writing process, leave them in the comments, and we will be sure to address those. Okay, I'm going to put a pillow behind my back. Oh, that feels better. Okay, so now, self-editing, yes. When do you do self-editing? Well, it can start while you're doing the first draft, if that works for you. For me, that's what I do. I usually will write one day, and then I will go back and do a quick edit. Now, this is the difference too. You don't want to do a really in-depth edit while you're drafting your novel, but I like to go back and do a quick edit on the thing I wrote the day before, so that I can make sure it actually says the things I intended for it to say. For example, I wrote a scene that I thought was like going to be really in depth and really kind of steamy and fun. And when I read it back, it wasn't as I had imagined it in my head. So I was able to tweak it a little bit and get that set up so that it made more sense. It was closer to what I wanted it to be. Now, if I had waited months, possibly months, until I actually got to that part in the writing process or the editing process, I may not have remembered how I intended that scene to be, and I might have missed some things. So for me, it's helpful to go back and just add in those things that you don't want to forget. But I don't do a very detailed edit on it, because if you do, you could be editing things and spending a lot of time on something that will ultimately not end up in your final draft, and it's just a waste of time for you. So that's some of the things. Okay, so ask Nana anything. I reread the next day, but major edits are at the end because I found that I change items and then need a major edit. Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm glad it's not just me, because I was like, everybody's like, don't edit while you draft. I was like, but I kind of do a little bit. But yes, definitely don't spend a lot of time on it. And also for me, because I'm a pantser, and I apparently don't have a very long memory span, I don't really know where I'm at in the book unless I go back and reread what I wrote. So in that rereading, that's kind of how it started with me, is I'd reread what I wrote the day before so that I could kind of get my head back in that space. And then I would just tweak a few things if something wasn't quite right. So yes, that was a great way to do it. Great way to explain it. And yeah. Anyway, okay, so again, keep any questions coming. I would love to chat with you, but let's just keep going through the self-editing process. So once quick edit. Yep, I like that term, quick edit. Thank you. Yes, it's just a quick overview. You just do quick little tweaks. You don't need to worry about punctuation so much here and stuff. I mean, I have always been that kind of person that needs to worry about punctuation, so I can't help myself sometimes. But again, it's not anything that I spend a ton of time on, because it could ultimately just get cut from the final draft and it would have been a waste of time for me. So again, it's just kind of getting my head in that writing space, in the story, where I'm at in the story, just making sure that how I meant it to come across the previous day as I was writing it kind of does. And then once I get to the end of the first draft, we're going to talk about the next step of self-editing, which is typically the developmental edit. So developmental edit is where you work on the story structure itself, like the plot holes, anything like that. You're going to work on the story structure. So my hair's doing a weird thing. Sorry, fool with my hair on these lives, because they're just, see what is happening. Okay, anyway, getting back to it. I'm just all over the place today. Okay, so the developmental edit is where you can even look at like character arc and character development here. But you want to make sure that the story is solid. That's your objective, the developmental edit. You want to make sure you don't have any plot holes. You want to make sure things are foreshadowed appropriately, which is nuanced. Sometimes it's a nuanced skill, which a lot of writing is actually, in the editing more specifically, is a very nuanced skill. But it's more about like kind of making sure that the story flows really well and all of that. Once you get done with the developmental edit, and spoiler alert, there are several different types of developmental edits. So yeah, it can be a little tricky, and this is usually where I spend most of my time, and this is usually where I spend most of my time procrastinating. It's not the best thing to do, I realize, but it's because I do several different developmental edits. So for example, one of my developmental edits I do is called what I call a timeline edit. And so I edit the book, and of course, every time I'm editing, I'm polishing as I go, because again, I can't help myself. I edit other people's books as well, so I just can't help myself tweaking and making sure things flow a little bit better. But that's not my primary objective. My primary objective in, for example, the timeline edit is to make sure that the timeline is solid. And I've noticed that for me, and even for some other authors, but for me specifically, this is one of the things I don't really pay as much attention to in the drafting process. Now, sometimes I will, and if I know it's going to be a very complicated timeline, then I will pay more attention while I'm drafting. But generally, when you're drafting, you're just trying to get the story out, especially me, because I'm a pantser. I don't know what's going to happen, so I'm just getting the story out. But when I go back and do the developmental timeline edit, I actually make, like, I pull out whether it's a spreadsheet or if it's a notebook, and I will note, like, this scene happened at this time, and this is like I actually put times on it. Sometimes it's like early afternoon, mid-afternoon, but sometimes it's like this happened at sunset, and then I'll go look up what's the sunset time for this time of year at this location, and then be like, okay, 7:05 p.m., the sun's setting, so it's like 6:30, so the sun's starting to set, and like kind of like all of that data that I love because I'm just such a data nerd. I love details. But I'll track all of that kind of data. And then it helps me realize when I have gaps in my timeline that don't make sense. So like someone references, oh, this happened yesterday. It's like, no, that was 2 weeks ago. Or more importantly, mine is like, oh yeah, I remember that happened like a few days ago. And I'm like, that was just yesterday. So it helps you kind of make sure that there's not those kind of gaps in your story. You can also edit for certain things specifically, like in my second book, The Prophecy of the Codex, I had prophecies, obviously, that I wanted to make sure were like important and followed through and like they matched and things like that. So I was doing a lot of referencing that way, making sure that they were all consistent. So the developmental edit, a lot of it is about consistency too. So it's just really helpful to identify what different developmental edits you need, where your weak points are. You can edit for one character's timeline, for example, if you want, or you can edit for each character and then just, you know, outline each one. But it's important not to shortcut here. It's important not to take shortcuts in the developmental edits, because if you do, your story is ultimately going to suffer. And it won't matter how many line edits you do or how much proofreading you do, the story is still not going to be solid if you skip the developmental stage. And it's important to do in the self-editing process because only you know what you want your story to be like. Your editor can help, your developmental editor can help for sure. But you don't want to try to like just pass it off to them without you being clear about what you want the story to be, because then the editor is just, they only have what's on the page. And if you aren't clear about what you want the story to be based on what's on the page, then your editor is going to struggle a little bit trying to figure out what you were trying to say, which is part of what they do. And the good ones are really going to, you know, be able to fill in those gaps for the most part. But the more self-editing you do, the stronger your novel is going to be, especially when you send it off to an editor. So again, if you are new here, we're answering questions all about writing, editing, publishing, whatever you would like to hear about. And it'll just, yeah. Oh, I have a hello. Hi, thank you for coming. Yeah, so any questions about the process? Right now I'm talking through, we had some, I had some questions in the past about self-editing, so I'm talking through the different drafts of that. But if you have any questions about anything at all, please feel free to leave them in the comments and we will talk about them. Okay, so after developmental edits, I like to throw in this edit that I call the cut. And it's basically, if you're an overwriter, this is helpful. If you're an underwriter, this might be more of like the writing part of your editing process because you need to fill it out. I've written books both ways, actually. So my first book, I had an edit called the cut. And I cut 10,000 words because it was just so superfluous. There was a lot of like me repeating myself. It was my first novel, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I was pantsing it. So I knew I needed to clean it up. So I deleted a lot of things. And part of that is what some people have called kill your darlings. I think that's a Stephen King term, possibly. Kill your darlings, or basically get rid of every single thing that's not needed. And you can get really down to the line here, and is this word actually needed? A lot of times it isn't, by the way. If you are questioning if it's needed, it probably isn't. See how the sentence looks like without it. Or if you can condense like 3 words into 1, that too. A lot of times, this is just a side thing, but when you're looking at adverbs, if you identify an adverb, usually they end with ly, but there's also things like now and almost that are adverbs. But if you look at and identify adverbs, even if you just look for ly words that end in ly, like supposedly or pointedly or quickly or slowly, things like that. If you look at those and you look at the verb that it's attached to, because it's adds to the verb, so that's why it's called an adverb. If you look at the verb it's attached to, sometimes you can say, like if it's walk slowly, maybe you can just replace that with one word, like sauntered. That's what walk slowly means. So yeah, things like that. That's just a side tip. Anyway, after you do the cut or the, I'm not sure what to call this, adding more words, more writing, the writing part of editing, self-editing. Anyway, whatever you want to call it. Then you'll do like the line editing, copy editing. Then you'll go on to proofreading, and then your book will be essentially ready for an editor, or nose itching, essentially ready for an editor or for the publishing process if you are not hiring an editor. Now, my opinion on this, like I said, I am a professional editor and I do edit books for a lot of authors, but I understand that sometimes it is cost prohibitive for every author in every book to hire an editor. Again, I firmly believe that every single book would benefit from an editor. It's kind of up to you, and this is why the self-editing process is so important, because if you self-edit your book, you can discover where your weak points are, maybe things that you are not so great at. If you're not great at grammar, then you definitely need a copywriter, a copy editor, I'm sorry, a line or copy editor, and a proofreader probably as well. And sometimes that copy editor will also do a proofread for you as part of the process. Sometimes it's an additional fee. It just depends on the editor themselves. But do your research before you hire them, so you know. So it's important to go through that whole self-editing process, because it really helps you understand where your weak points are. It helps you get really into the nitty-gritty of your story and make it the very best thing it can be. It will help you more clearly express your story that's in your head and get it out into the page, because you've written it down, and that's like great. Now you have the beginnings of the story, but you really have the self-editing process is where you really make it shine. And then an editor will just take it to that next level. Okay. I think I've kind of talked about all of this, and we didn't have any other questions today. So I'm going to wrap this up and go get some lunch. Because I eat lunch late, apparently. Okay, so thank you guys so much for showing up and for hearing my chat about self-editing. That's kind of what it turned into today. But I think it's really important to think about is the self-editing process. It's not just let's write the first draft and pass it off to an editor. Now, some people do that. If your editor's cool with it, cool. But I have had this happen to me before, and it was a struggle as the editor to know what they were actually trying to say, because a lot of times, I mean, sometimes while you're writing, like you use maybe a wrong word, and an editor can usually pinpoint like when things are misspelled and there's a different version of the word, or kind of guess what word they were trying to get at. But as the author, you will lose a lot if you do not self-edit your book. Or at the very, very least, and this is the very least, I'm talking at the very least, you need to read through it once and tweak things and make sure it flows well. And make sure it says what you want it to say, because like I said, that scene that I wrote before, this is, I think, earlier this year, and I had written a scene, and it was like a scene in a shower, and it wasn't a romance novel, so it wasn't like anything on screen, but it still in my head was like kind of steamy a little bit for being a closed door type situation, but it was still kind of like this like sexy type sensual thing. And then when I read it back, I'm like, that's not how I read back. So I wanted to make sure that I infused that kind of magic into it. And when I did, in going back and rereading it, and then tweaking a little bit, adding a little bit to it, it really felt like the scene that I wanted to write. And so now when I go through and do the developmental edit and the copy edit and the proofreading, it's going to be that much more smoothly, because I understood where I was, because my brain was still in that mode of how I had written it. It was only like 24 hours later. I was able to express more clearly on the page what I wanted to say back then, what was in my head. And then, of course, after the self-editing process, you want to step away from it between each draft, if possible. Definitely after you draft versus when you edit. Now, this can become a procrastination thing. Take it from me, because this is my favorite form of procrastination, is to not get back and edit after a certain amount of time. So it's usually months go by after I write the first draft and I'm completely forgotten about it. And then I have to go back and like do like a reread just to get my head back in the space before I can edit. So I don't recommend that much time, but however much time it takes you to step away from the drafting process and shift your brain into editing mode, which is more, the drafting process can be more intuitive and the editing process can be more logical. So that shift is important to make, which is why they suggest a gap between the two. Okay, well, I hope this is super helpful. I'm going to wrap up. If you guys ever have any questions or anything, please feel free to DM me. I do still have some openings on the Magic of Show Magic of Show versus Tell Mastermind that's running right now. It actually closes on Monday. So we've only got a few more days left, and I do have a few openings left. So if you're interested in that, the link is in my bio on Instagram. I think I put it in the description on YouTube and Facebook, but I'll double check and make sure. But yeah, basically it is a 6-week live writing program that will help you learn all of the different writing tools. And also, I've got some bonus trainings on mindset to help you really get into the right headspace for writing. And so it's really productive for you. It's really just everything I learned in the 13 years that I've been writing, but the 10 years it took me to write my first book. I wanted to take all the information, everything I learned, and condense it into a program so you guys don't have to take the 10 years that I did to learn all these things. You can learn from someone who's been there, who took the time to do the trial and error and actually, get that download of all of that information in 6 weeks instead of 10 years. And so it's going to be a really fun program. It's going to be informative. There's a lot of in-depth trainings. It's going to be really enjoyable. So the information is all at that link. I would love if you would check it out, and I would love to have you in it because it's just going to be a fun community, supportive community where we can all help each other. And we're going to do a lot of application sections. So you'll actually make some progress on your book, and it'll just be a good time. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. I'll talk to you later. Bye, Facebook and YouTube.